What's going on, guys? Reaper here, and welcome to Reaper Declassified. We are now officially on episode 9 of the Project 69 GTO War Angel build. In this episode, I'm going to be showing you guys how I built this custom A-pillar gauge pod. Okay, so this is essentially the second to last episode in what I'm calling the first season of this build. And this gauge pod is actually one of the very first things I made for this project. Okay, so for those of you that don't know, the original A-pillar pads in these old muscle cars or old cars in general were originally made out of steel, whereas the newer or replacement panels that you can get for these A-pillars are usually made out of a thick, heavy foam or even plastic. So this is the original A-pillar panel that was still in the car when I bought it. The right-hand passenger side was missing, so ultimately I decided to go ahead and take the driver's side panel and turn it into this gauge pod. Now you can purchase A-pillar gauge pods for a variety of different vehicles. However, at the time I was not able to find anyone that was making one for a 69 GTO, unfortunately. And I'm sure, as most of you guys have already figured out by now, that the whole overall plan and design for the interior of this build is to ultimately have an aircraft style look. This includes everything from gauges on the A-pillar and gauges all over the dash, warning lights, toggle switches, overhead lights, blackout lights, you name it. It's all going to be inside the interior of this thing. So when you get in here, it's almost like being in the cockpit. Now, when I started out with this project, I essentially only had 3 main pieces that needed to be able to go into this. Of course, being number 1 is the A-pillar pad itself, a leftover piece of exhaust pipe, and just a little old cheapo 3-pod gauge panel that you can get at pretty much any auto parts store. So, of course, nothing too complicated. However, the one thing that had to be taken into consideration is that these panels are super cheap, thin, and flimsy sheet metal. And the A-pillar panel and exhaust pipe are quite a bit thicker. Now, if you do any welding or fabrication, then you know that this can be done anyway. You just make sure you weld on your thicker side, or your thicker steel, and then flow it into your thinner metal. Not a big deal. Or you can accomplish this, since it's not a structural weld, just by doing a whole bunch of little tack welds, and then you can go back through, grind it down, clean it up later. So essentially I wound up cutting the circular part of, or the rounded part of, the exhaust pipe, and give me that angle that I needed for the gauge pod, at whatever elevation I needed. And then I cut this down in the front to use for the actual mounting part of the gauge pods. So I split them down the middle. Now, originally I had intended 3 gauge pods. So 1, 2, and number 3 was going to be here. So I went ahead and cut out 1 hole, 2 hole, 3 holes. But ultimately I decided that 3 was just a little too busy. I felt that after mocking up and cutting everything out and getting these first 2 gauge pods kind of done and finished, and going back and forth and test fitting it to the vehicle just to see where they were sitting and to make sure everything was exactly how I wanted it.
So I'm probably going to just take the piece I cut out of that, weld it back in, smooth it out.
I just decided that 3 was going to be too much. It was going to sit a little too high, a little higher than I wanted, but it was ultimately just too much to be trying to keep an eye on from left to right, especially if I'm still having gauges here where they need to be and extras down on the center console area as well.
So I took the pieces I cut out of this and went ahead and welded it back in,
which you can see right here in this area. It was like 3 or 4 separate pieces, and like I said, I just wound up welding them back together and welded them back into the panel. And then right there you can see that's where the exhaust pipe was, there and there. And I had to do a little filling here in the corners to help give this a raised look, so it's all smooth and even coming all the way around and down to the pad itself. Now, after all that was said and done, I wound up going back over this thing and taking all the welds down, smoothing it out, and then ultimately going over it with a filler or Bondo to help smooth things out, and then painted it in a truck bed liner. And I think it came out pretty nice. I'm happy with it, and it kind of gave me a new challenge to try something different and just see if I could make this little idea I had in my head come to life. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and of course, we'll be back next Wednesday with episode 10. And will essentially be the final episode of what I'm calling Season 1 of this build. In that episode, I essentially start building something that was originally planned and designed for my 70 Chevelle and not the War Angel, and unfortunately kind of ended in a hospital visit. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that notification bell to stay up to date with this build. Until next time, guys, remember, stay frosty, ride or die, Reaper out.